Everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the Italian Renaissance art and mainly focus on Renaissance architecture. This is going to be really the birthplace of the Renaissance ideas, and we're going to pick up on some of the themes that we've been taking a look at with the political and economic developments with the Medici family, and then them investing their money to create cultural developments such as the thoughts and the ideas and the cultural manifestations of the Renaissance. And so we're going to take a look at applying some of the ideas that we talked about last lecture with humanism and Neoplatonism. So I want you to be able to start applying these ideas into how we see this within the arts. We left off here taking a look at the aesthetics of the Renaissance, which is heavily influenced by ancient Greece and Rome, focused on realism, idealism, emotion, mathematics, classicism, and Christianity, an eternal yearning, and the role, the heightened role of the artist. Before we get going, I wanted just to take a little bit of time here just to review, give you some sample questions to again consider to go back. I won't do this throughout the entire semester, but I just want to make sure that you're prepared as we go forward for the first exam so you know what to expect. So the first sample question I have for you is, he increased his father's wealth and prestige in Florence through a system of favors and by negotiating peace with Rome. He was later known as Magnificent. He founded the arts and took in an aspiring artist known as Michelangelo. Right. So is that Giovanni Medici, Pope Leo X, Lorenzo Medici, or Pope Martin V? Right. Something to think about. Which of the following is not part of the artistic values of the Renaissance? Abstraction, realism, mathematics, classicism. Right. So that's again getting you to think about these terms, and some of these are a little bit more basic than the ones that you'll see on the exam. Some of them might be a little on the exam. You might see how did this principle influence the Renaissance, or how do we see this principle within this specific work of art? But I just want to start getting your feet wet to so you know what to take notes on and what's important. And then the last sample question I have for you is, this movement began in Italy as a way to go back to the ancient Greek and Roman philosophies to find a universal understanding of humans. And so what was the philosophical movement that was seeking to go back to understand language, to understand the original intent of the artist, and then to find commonalities, and those commonalities they believed to be truths? Was that Neoplatonism, existentialism, classicism, or humanism, right? And I'm not going to tell you the answers here. I want you to be able to go back and to find them on your own, to think through them, right? Think through the process of them. If you don't know, that's fine, but just go back and to refresh your your notes, or refresh your mind, and find the answer. So there's a lot of growth that happens within finding the answer, and not knowing an answer is only means that you have some room for growth, which is a great opportunity to grow. Mainly, our discussion today is going to on Renaissance architecture is going to center around the Florence dome that you see here. We're going to take a look at Brunelleschi and how Brunelleschi's design here revolutionized the modern architecture and inspired a generation of artists to emulate what he has completed. And so we'll talk about that. So that's kind of where we're building up to. Just to juxtapose the Renaissance art with the art that preceded it. It's always good for me, at least, as I go through these eras, to think about how they're different from the past, so we can kind of chart them within human development and progress. Taking a look at some works that come from the late Middle Ages. Mainly what we see with a lot of the Middle Ages is art that centers around Christianity, which makes sense. We talked about scholasticism and Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica last time. We've talked about how the late Middle Ages really doesn't see beyond a Christian lens. There is really no secular realm. The secular to them is something that is earthly, or something that is beneath, right? Something that's more associated with sin. And so they want to transcend the earthly realm and to focus more on the divine. And so their art is going to reflect that. So you're going to see a lot of images of Madonna and baby Jesus here. This is what's known as Madonna enthroned. It's a common motif that we see Here we just see Duccio's rendition of this, surrounded by angels, and mainly, I mean, it's beautiful in that it's great into its own self, but it's mainly just showing that the world that the late Middle Ages focus on is the world of Christianity. On the right hand side, we see Klaus Schluter, who is a northern artist, and his Well of Moses. And so again, we see a heavy focus on Christian themes, which we're going to see within the Renaissance. It's not to say that the Renaissance completely, disregards all Christian themes. They don't. They're just going to do it differently. There's going to be a different emphasis that I want you to be able to note. Here, what we see with the Well of Moses, which is kind of leaning more towards the Renaissance. Schluter is kind of on that cusp of pushing towards the Renaissance. He's 1395. Renaissance, I would argue, begins in about 1401. So he's like right there, but we're going to see is still within his works of art is they're lacking a little bit of life. They're lacking a little bit of realism. I mean, it looks realistic. We notice that there's 2 eyes, a nose, and a beard, and the horns on his head, which we'll talk about later, and then the tablets in his hand. So we recognize that to be Moses as the lawgiver who came, down from Sinai, giving the 10 Commandments to the Israelites. But there's not as much emphasis on his skin and his muscle structure and his bone structure, which the Renaissance is really going to focus on heavily, is that emphasis on realism. And we'll take a look at that. Other works that are secular during the late Middle Ages, one of the main ones is by the Limburg brothers, known as the Très Rich Hours. Très Rich Hours is just French for the very rich hours. Mainly, this is just a calendar cycle of what daily life was like. And so what we see here is just kind of a mass of bodies, and they're kind of piled on one another, and just going to give you a sense of what daily life is like. But if you notice the hand structures, for instance, the hands that they have here, they seem as though they're just kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, flabby, kind of. There's not really anything there. There's not really, the bone structure that's there. If you take a look at the hands and the structure here, it just seems as though they're kind of just pasted on, kind of like a photo collage pasted on the page here. And so we're going to see somewhat different themes of that. What we'll also see during the late Middle Ages is a focus. This was known as the Dance of Death. Generally, the Dance of Death is a common motif during the late Middle Ages, where people are surrounded by skeletons or the Grim Reaper, and they're all kind of dancing towards their doom. And the reason why this was so important during the late Middle Ages is because of the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague, which killed about a third of Europe, so its mortality rate was about 33%, whereas COVID is about 3%. And so COVID's serious in its own right. But the bubonic plague was extremely devastating to their culture and to their life. It made death seem prevalent. It made death seem inescapable. And so people are influenced by their surroundings, and they create art. Art always mirrors the world in which they live. And so their art focuses on the things that were important to them. But most of the late Middle Ages, a lot of their art is going to focus on more sadness, remorse. Themes that they were influenced by were the plague, as we've mentioned, famine, which was pretty prevalent during the 1300s, and also war, right? And these events gave a darker view of the human condition, one of humanity's impending doom. It felt to them as though they were living in the end of times, and that the second coming was near to them. And so many of them believed that this was the end of humanity. And so we see that within their works. What we're going to see within the Renaissance is a different theme, more optimism, more upbeat, more harmony, more balance within them. I like to start the discussion of the Renaissance with these two works, which were only done 30 years apart. And so they are very close historically in creation. Cimabue, you see on the left, and Giotto on the right. What we see within their works is a common motif with the late Middle Ages, and that is Madonna enthroned, Madonna sitting on a throne with baby Jesus in her lap, surrounded by angels. And what we see within these two works of art are similarities, right? Similar colors, similar kind of color scheme. This one is on tempera, and tempera is a type of adhesive that takes the pigment and then makes it stick to the canvas. It was made from egg yolk, and so it's going to have that kind of yellowish golden kind of hue to it. It's going to be a little bit different from the paints that they use during the Renaissance. So similar kind of structure, similar theme, but also some vast differences. And so what I want you to do is I want you to think about what these differences are, right? And then which one do you like better, right? As we see, one of the major differences that we see is the concept of space. What we see with Cimabue on the left is that the angels seem as though they're stacked on top of one another. It seems as though a steamroller has rolled over Madonna and baby Jesus and kind of flattened them. And then they're just kind of placed on top of these kind of founding fathers of the church that are at the bottom. Where Giotto is seeking to do something quite different, right? He's trying to push the plane back into the canvas to try to create the illusion of depth on his surface. And so what we see with his works is we see that Madonna's knee seems as though it goes a little bit away from her torso. We see some of the folds look like they're close. Some are closer to us, some are further away. We see that baby Jesus' legs seem as though they're coming towards us, the viewer. And as we take a look at the saints, it seems as though they're not necessarily stacked on top of one another, but they're just kind of positioned kind of back surrounding the throne. And so there's that indication of depth, which makes it feel more realistic. Also, if you take a look at each of the angels of Cimabue, they all look pretty much the same, right? They even almost look somewhat like Mary, right? Whereas Giotto tries to create a sense of individuality within each of them, making them look somewhat different, somewhat unique, to give them a sense of individuality, right? And what we're going to see within Giotto's work is he's trying to create this sense of realism, right? And that's not to say that Cimabue, was less of an artist. I mean, the focus of the Middle Ages, if you wanted to create something divine, it shouldn't look like the real world, right? It should look different than that because it's something spiritual, and something spiritual transcends what we can see. And we often hear that in the scriptures when we hear about something so sacred that it defied words, right? And so what they're suggesting is that, how do you depict the divine? What does the divine even look like? And if it's beyond words, then it's kind of beyond our ability to, recreate something within the visual world. And so Cimabue's focus is not to create the physical world, right? But Giotto has a different focus. Giotto suggests that God created this world and he patterned it after, right, the divine. And so then if we're going to mirror God's creations, mirror the divine, we need to use the world around us. And so he tries to make his more realistic. And so what we see here between, Cimabue and Giotto in this, 30-year gap is that this is going to be the transition of the Renaissance, right? They're trying to move away from this older, kind of more mystical view of art to more of a realistic application of art. And so they're trying to find how the eye sees and how the body is made in order to create more realism. Both of these works of art, you see Giotto's here is on the left and Cimabue's is on the right. But they're in the same room, interestingly enough, in a museum in Florence known as the Uffizi, which used to be the office building for the Medici family. They're both in the same room. They're about the same size. You can kind of take a look. They're huge, right? So there's a guy taking a picture in the background. Just give you a sense of size, right? So some perspective on that. I wanted to start the discussion of the Renaissance in 1401, right? So Giotto is one of the main kind of leaders of the Renaissance art movement, right? He's kind of beginning that trend, right? So he sees a trend towards realism. But I want to argue that the actual date of the Renaissance begins in 1401 with a competition for the baptistry doors. And this is the baptistry. This is right next door to the Florence Cathedral, which I've shown you in a number of slides, and I'll show you again in just a moment. But what the idea was for the Catholic Church is you couldn't enter into the cathedral until you were baptized. And then once you got baptized, then you go in the cathedral and have, your sacraments and whatnot. And so this was outside for people to get baptized before they were able to be allowed to enter into the cathedral. And it's shaped as an octagon, right? And so there's 8 sides to it, and then there's 2 main entrances. There's you can see here, there's one over on this side towards the left, and there's one over here towards the right. What happens is in 1401 they want to complete these doors here on the right, and they put out there this here's this competition, please submit your works to the Clothmakers Guild of Florence. And this was a pretty lucrative offer, because not only would you get your artwork on one of the major doors in Florence, it was going to take like 15 years to create these panels, right? This series of doors for the baptistry. And so that meant you're going to, as an artist who sometimes doesn't have regular income, this means that for 15 years you're going to have a pretty substantial income. And so, most artists really were interested in putting something together. There were 3 main rules to this competition. The first one is it had to be the same dimension, right? And the dimension of these doors is probably about 2 feet by 2 feet, something like that. And it was the second rule was it had to depict the story of Abraham and Isaac. And so it was to depict this particular scene. Just let me read through this real quickly. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham. And he said, Take now thy son, thy only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and offer him there a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place which God had told him. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, Behold, and this is like one of my favorite lines, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to a place which God had told them of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay a son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, for now I know thou fearest God, seeing that thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and looked, and beheld him, a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, and offered him up a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And so this was the scene. It doesn't necessarily say how they're supposed to represent this scene, but it's supposed to be about Abraham going up to sacrifice his son, and then the angel coming down and stopping, and then providing the ram in the thicket. So that's the second rule. And the third rule was that they had 1 year to complete, right? So in 1402, they were supposed to be done with their rendition of Abraham and Isaac. And that sounds like a lot of time, a year to complete a project. But what they were doing is they're creating this in bronze. And in order to create something in bronze, you have to first sculpt your image, your reverse image, inside clay, right? Inside clay molds. And so think of them like Jell-O molds, but you have to do this inside clay. And then you have to harden the clay. And then you have to bring the 2 sides of the mold together, right? In order to then pour molten bronze inside the mold. Then wait for it to harden, and then have your image, right? However, the problem was that if there were any air pockets in the clay, it would immediately crack when the molten bronze hit it, and then you'd have to start all over and carve your design again into the clay. And so it actually took a long time to do. It's rumored that Michelangelo, he really didn't like to work in bronze, but every time he did, he would go to the Pope to get a blessing because it was such a difficult, painstaking process that he didn't want to start over with, right? So it was excruciating, right? And so mainly what happened is that there were two major individuals that came out, that the Clothmakers Guild, as they were looking at these images, they saw two of them that really were head and shoulders above everyone else. And I wanted to show you these two. The first one is by Brunelleschi. And what we see within his image is we see Abraham and Isaac, and then we see the angel over here on the left-hand side, and then we see, just kind of to balance that, we see kind of a tree over here. We see the ram in the thicket on the other side, and then we see the two attendants with the donkey, right? So it's kind of interesting that the way that he's kind of focusing on this. And so to try to, teach how to read this image, the first thing we need to focus on is what's at the center. What does Brunelleschi focus on? Where do our eyes first go, right? And at the center of this is the sacrifice, right? And then he balances the ram, right, the actual object to be sacrificed later, within Isaac, who's the servant, who's going to do the sacrifice. Then he balances the angel with the kind of the mountain or cliff on the other side. And then he kind of places below them, right? So this is a spiritual scene, so it's supposed to be elevated, right? So the closer up you get, the closer you get to God. The servants then are below them with the donkey. The second one that they were kind of debating between was by Ghiberti. Ghiberti just has the same kind of, the same story, right? But he puts Abraham here at the center. Then we have Isaac over here on the right-hand side, balanced by the two servants and the donkey here. And then we have the angel up on top, and then the ram in the thicket, the object that's going to be sacrificed, up on top as well, right? So again, as we start to, think about the composition, where things are in relationship to one another, think about where our eyes go first, right? And so Ghiberti chooses to tell the story from the perspective of Abraham, right? Because Abraham is the center, that's where our eyes initially go. That this is Abraham's test. This is his challenge to see whether he's going to be obedient to God or not. And then he puts the two, kind of the spiritual thing of the rams as the sacrifice, right? The vicarious sacrifice. And the angel up above. And then he separates, it kind of interestingly has the cliff which separates this scene from the spiritual scene here, right? From this earthly scene. And so he has this cliff here that kind of separates them from the spiritual realm and the kind of the secular realm. And then he puts Isaac at the far corner. And so as we see these two images together, I want you to think as though you were on the Clothmakers Guild. Which one would you choose, right? Which one do you think did a better rendition or captures the message of what Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac does, right? And essentially, right, they were leaning more towards one, but they didn't want to, they liked both of them. And so what the Clothmakers Guild does, and so this is kind of the rest of the story here, they decide to award both of them the commission, right? But you'll just have to split the commission. And Brunelleschi was offended by that. He didn't like that offer, and so he rejected it. And so the commission went to Ghiberti on the right. But what Ghiberti's image does, though, what's kind of interesting about it, and what people really like about Ghiberti's, is it focuses more on, rather than this kind of forceful object to be acted upon, right? Which what we kind of see with Brunelleschi is his images are almost kind of similar in line with the Middle Ages, where people are just a pawn in God's kind of game, where Abraham just kind of grabs Isaac by the throat and getting ready to put that blade right at his throat, and it has to be the angel that comes in and physically stops it, right? So it's kind of using, humans just kind of pushing and directing them to wherever they need to go. Whereas Ghiberti's focuses more on free will, more on human power, right? And this is going to be more in line with what Mirandola is finding and the humanists are finding during the Renaissance. What we see is rather than putting that blade right at his throat, we have a bit of a pause by Abraham, right? As he's willing to do it, but also he realizes that this is a sacrifice, right? Sacrificing your son is not an easy task. We also see that Isaac is much older, right? And almost as though he can take his father, he can hold his own, but he is willing to subject his will to the will of his father and the will of God, right? And so we see much more emphasis on human power to make decisions rather than on divine powers to control humanity. And so a lot of people like Ghiberti's image better for that reason, right? And it's whichever one you like is fine, right? I'm just giving you some ideas to consider. Both of these works of art are in the Bargello in Florence. Both of them are next to each other in the wall, so you can kind of see and there tells the story here of the competition that I just told you. And then this is my wife. She doesn't know that I'm showing a picture of her, so that's between us. But this is going to give you the sense of the size, right? The sense of perspective for this. And so Ghiberti gets awarded the doors, and so here is me standing next to them, and so this is kind of the finished product. They don't have the originals outside anymore. They decided to take them inside, and so inside there's a museum of the Florence Cathedral, and you can see the originals that Ghiberti did, and so you can see how huge these are, why it would take 15 years to be able to complete. But Michelangelo, when he later, Michelangelo comes in at the end of the 1400s, when he sees these doors, he calls them the gates to paradise, right? He says, these doors are worthy enough to be at the gates of heaven, right? And so it happens as a result of Brunelleschi's loss. That's kind of the main thing that sparks the Renaissance. Brunelleschi leaves Florence. He's so distraught that he lost, that he goes to Florence and he heads south to Rome. What he's interested in Rome is he's interested in studying Roman art and architecture, much like what the humanists are doing with language. Brunelleschi is doing with art and architecture. He brought with him his apprentice, who is a young aspiring sculptor known as Donatello, and so Donatello's art is going to be heavily influenced by his trip to Rome with Brunelleschi. In Rome, they raided the ancient sites looking for art to uncover the mysteries of ancient thinkers and artists. And what was interesting to this is most of the people at the time when they were there, they thought they were just fortune hunters. And they didn't really, a lot of the Romans that were there at the time really didn't pay much attention to them. But they were kind of intrigued by the fact that these artists were coming in and touching these ancient artifacts, because they believed that these artifacts were cursed because they had pagan images on them. And they're like, you only should be touching Christian images. What are you guys doing? And they wanted to understand what the mysteries of these ancients, right? And so Donatello was studying sculpture, but Brunelleschi was mainly interested in a secret project that he wrote in code. Mainly he wrote backwards because he was afraid that someone was going to steal his designs. But he was interested in this building at the center of Rome known as the Pantheon. The Pantheon was built as an ancient Roman pagan temple. And what he was interested in was the mathematical precision, right? The idea of a circle, which is a mathematically perfect shape, with the square. And so he's interested in this dome and then the simple shape of the porch here, just giving this kind of simple square and round shape to it. And this is what it looks like today. You just kind of go in the middle of the city, it just kind of pops up. But what he's mainly interested in, though, is the dome, right? And this is the oculus at the very center of the dome. And when it rains in Rome and you're in the Pantheon, you get wet because because there's a hole in the top, and at the bottom is a series of drains, and so it's not as though you're standing in a puddle of water. It'll just naturally kind of drain out. But what he was interested in is this dome and how the ancients were able to create this. Because the people during the Middle Ages, and people even, like Brunelleschi's era, they believed that it was kind of magical, that they kind of called it the House of Spirits, because it seemed as though the dome just kind of floated on top of the building. They didn't really know how it was created or how it stood there, and so they were extremely. Brunelleschi was extremely interested in that design. What the problem was is that the technique was lost. The Romans used ash in addition to small rocks to make their buildings, and the ash makes it extremely light but also extremely strong. And as you see here, is that this is a cross section of the Pantheon. Another technique that they used is as it gets closer and closer to the top, it gets thinner and thinner, which makes it a lot lighter, right? And so one of the problems with a dome is hoop stress, right? And so generally within any type of architectural building, you're going to have a force of the roof that's naturally kind of pushing down, right? If you just had a roof on here, it's going to naturally push down on the walls, right? And so architects have been able to compensate for that by building thicker walls. But the difference with a dome though, is that it has hoop stress, right? So hoop stress is kind of like if you were to take a stick and you were to bend it and bend it to a point where before it breaks, right? What's that stick trying to do? What kind of force are you feeling? And that force is generally pushing not down but out, right? And so that's the same with a dome, right? It has this hoop stress where it's not just pushing down, but it's also pushing out. And so the technique of being able to compensate for that hoop stress was lost. And so they didn't necessarily know how to create a dome. But he was interested in this design, right? This idea of simplicity, of circles and squares. And the circles represent the divine, right? This perfect kind of shape that goes on. And the square here represents kind of the perfect shape of the physical realm, right? And so, just to give you a kind of a juxtaposition between the older Gothic kind of architecture in Reims, France, with the Pantheon, right? What he's looking for, what Brunelleschi is looking for, is simplicity. He's not necessarily looking for all this ornamentation. That's kind of all the sculptures and the flying buttresses and all of the arches. They're looking for simplicity. And so when they started the Florence Cathedral back in the 1200s, they wanted this simple design. They didn't want all the flying buttresses. They didn't want all of the gaudy, ornate structure. They just wanted something very simple, very, very much like the ancient Greek and Roman buildings. And so just to give you the juxtaposition, right, we see the flying buttresses here, and the flying buttresses are a way to help support the walls so that you can make higher buildings. But the Florentines didn't want that, right? They wanted to create something without the flying buttresses because it just looked too ornate and gaudy. You can see a little bit here towards this side of the building, but mostly they wanted to avoid that if possible. Some of the problems, though, that the Florence Dome had, right? Number one is the walls are approximately 140 to 150 feet high, right? So from here down to here, it's about 140 to 150 feet, right? Which was about the maximum height for walls at the time. And the base of this was about 140 feet, and so it's about 140 feet here. And so what that means is the walls are already at max, and they don't want to add flying buttresses, and so you can't really have a very heavy roof. And then the other problem was that you're going to have a very large roof because you have this immense space. And so it's going to necessitate a heavy roof. And so it's kind of that problem, right? So the height of the dome is going to reach 367 feet. And so this is going to be enormous, right? It's going to weigh over 37,000 tons, right? With over more than 4 million bricks. right? After the Council of Constance, right? We talked about the Council of Constance in 1415 to unify the Catholic Church back in, with one pope, right? They kept electing popes and they kept, excommunicating each other. And finally, the Council of Constance, Martin V was elected to become the new pope, and he was heading back to Rome to regain the papacy in Rome after the council. However, the papacy home was so dilapidated that they wanted to fix it up for him before he got there, and so he decided to stay in Florence with his good friend Giovanni Medici. However, now that the Pope is in your hometown, right, there's a problem because the Florence Cathedral was not completed. They didn't know how to complete the dome. And so for the most part, this was just a wide open gap, right? And so for the cathedral was begun in 1296. And so now about 122 years later, you still just have everything's completed except for this dome. And so there's this big gaping hole. And so it's kind of embarrassing, right, to have the Pope in your hometown and your cathedral is not done, because the cathedral is really the symbol of your town. And so the Medicis wanted to make sure that this was going to be completed. And so in 1418, Cosimo Medici decided to solve the problem of the cathedral, and so he designs another competition, right? Just about at this time, Brunelleschi is now heading back from Rome, and he's heading back with all of his studies of the Pantheon, right? And so the competition was to see if you can complete, find a way to do a dome, right? One of the designs was to fill the dome, the interior of the dome, with scaffolds. And so here you see let me see if I have a better shot. The interior of the dome, so the idea was just kind of build it all with scaffolds here. And so that would be able to support the dome and be able to compensate for some of the hoop stress. But the problem is you do not have really a functional dome, right? You just have a bunch of scaffolds here, and it doesn't really look right, right? Another of the designs was to fill this area here with dirt. Just kind of pour a bunch of dirt in here, and then you can just kind of, fill in the dome and just kind of build around it. And again, that would help to some extent to support the dome. But then you're, having to go to church with, a bunch of dirt. They'd have to wall it off or something. But it wasn't really practical. And so in 1418, Brunelleschi comes back and he says, I have a design. I know how to do it. It needs no interior support. You don't need any type of scaffolding inside. The dome itself will be supported. And the people, the judges of this competition said, great. Let us know your design. And he says, I tell you what, I want you to balance